Bob Koenn, which must know, and Richard Fox and Joy Fox, who are from Orlando. And actually, a funny story was when I was in high school, I started getting my rocketry magazine, and of course I saw Fox Mitter stuff, and I saw Richard Fox and MIT Rocket Society and all this stuff. So one day when I'm in college, I decided I'd been out of rocketry for 2 years, and I'm going to get back into rocketry again. And I go down to the old Colonial Mall, and I walk in the front one Saturday, and here's the Orange Rocketeers, and he's standing there, and I went up and I went, "Are you like Richard Fox from up north of Fox Mitter fame? What the hell are you doing down here?"
You guys get your intro?
Anyway, I guess that was like the kickoff of the era of model rocketry in Florida in the early days. But even before that, were they in our
Yeah. Probably easier to.
Oh, just, yeah. So, personally, around 15 years old, around 15 years old, I got my big interest started developing in rocketry, and so in high school I formed the Rocket Club. So that was like my Tarpon Spring High School Rocket Club from 1969 about.
Right?
Yeah.
That's you.
That was the 1970 group with my Saturn V, which I bought that summer, and I think my buddy Dale steal a Saturn 1D. And actually my sponsor was never really interested, but he just did it so I could have a club. Well, when he left the school, my dad became the sponsor, and he was actually a librarian. I just needed a sponsor, so that was probably some of the early beginnings. And I remember in senior high, there was a club in Orlando, and they had a contest. So me and 3 other guys drove over from Tarpon to Orlando for Friday night and held a contest right out near where 436 and UCS Boulevard, where there was an old decrepit industrial area, and we actually had a little contest out there, which may have been the first quarter rocket contest ever. I mean, that was, no, I didn't know these people. I mean, that was like 71, so we didn't know. Then, after I met Richard, they had already started having one rocketeer, and you started having these mine schools over in Pasco County. This stuff all goes into that.
Okay, so do you want to, should we try and get some continuity?
Yeah, so that was like the early, when I was in high school and first in college, and then the real build-up started with the Orange Rocketeers, and then the Pasco County group, and then also the Broward County, or whatever, BCMRA, I think the Broward County Model Rocket
BCMRA.
Yeah. They had a van that they used, trailer they used to pull around, and they would, that became launch control. You remember that?
They had a Kaplinger?
Larry Kaplinger was an
Was a
engineer.
Motorola electronics engineer. He's another old Florida rocketeer, and yeah, he was into electronics, and he built at the time a kind of sophisticated automatic countdown, numbers out of the pad, digitally, fancy launch system.
Yeah, it was overkill, but it was kind of exciting to
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
All right, so we're going to put a little chronology to this. I met my wife, Joy, through the space program and through model rocketry, in fact. So we'll start with her story, and that begins with the space race.
I had the privilege of knowing at the time that I was living history, and a lot of this, you remember, if you were in the other talk that,
One of the guys.
yeah, Les gave, Wes gave. He was talking about the early days, about growing up in front of the television set and watching history before 9/11 shut down everything at the Cape and made things very difficult to get into. They used to take us on tours, and the tours would stop at some of the early places from the Mercury program, and this was the Blockhouse launch facility. Wes was describing how the graphics were done for the Mercury liftoff. This blockhouse is where the launch control was done for Mercury. There were no windows in it. They couldn't see the rocket. All they could see was the telemetry that was coming back to them, which was, compared to today, of course, very antiquated. I did have, I taught out in Brevard County, and a lot of my kids were kids of the space workers, and they got me into things that normally you can't get into. One is the LEM simulator. Alan Shepard had a fit about having people walk through on the catwalk up on top when they were practicing in the simulator. So they had to stop that, and the tours would no longer bring people in. This was a day that I guess they were not in practice, and one of the workers that, one of my kids, his father, worked on the simulators, and they got me inside the LEM simulator, and the guys turned on a starfield out the left portal, and I said, that's as close as I'm going to get to going into space. But out the left portal, you could see the moon's surface, and that's what they used to practice their landings on. And we were also able to get inside the VAB. I had a teacher out at Rollins College who was a space nut, and he took us on a bus tour through Kennedy Space Center. We got into the VAB while they were assembling the stages of the Saturns. Those of you that are expert in reading the numbers on them can probably tell which stage it is and which rocket it is. I'm not that expert, but we also got into the back side of 34, and here's the flame trench. And when the rockets go up, of course, these flamethrowers are moved into the trench to disperse the flames, which is why you see that big plume of smoke come out the side of the rocket instead of straight down. Again, this is the pad, and with one of the rockets on it and on the transporter. The bay doors of the VAB, and it had, since the rocket is about 360 feet high, the bay doors go up about 365, 367. Wes was talking about the big crane on top of the VAB, which is used to move the rocket out of the bay doors. This is the elevator area, but out of the bay doors and out of their cocoons, rather, to the bay doors so they can move them out on the transporter. But this crane is large. Some of the sign, I think the Colby part of the crane sign is the size of a bus. Very, very large. It's hard to appreciate the size of things, but if you look at the elevator doors, that might give you some indication of the size of things in there. This is looking down where the visitors would come. They were allowed into this part, and a mock-up of one of the cones. But this is the 34th floor looking down at that area. Apollo 17, I had a press pass for Apollo 17, so I covered it from rollout to liftoff. And this was the night, supposed to be the night before launch. It was December the 5th. We went out to watch the service tower being pulled away from the rocket once the rocket was on the pad. They bust us out there. This is the service tower, quite a distance already from the rocket. A little bit overexposed so you could get some of the lights that were on the rocket. They stayed on all night, of course, and lit it up. Beautiful. One of my favorite vehicles that ever went into space. Apollo, this 17, and Venus is up here. And this was dawn of December the 6th. We went back out, I think I got 5 hours sleep in 36, but we went back out and watched the sun come up behind the rocket. Again, the lights. And this is the night before. Now, notice that the date changed. The reason the date changed is because liftoff actually went at 12:33 a.m. the next morning. They didn't get it off quite on time. The Saturn, when it first lifted off, the flames were so bright that 3 miles away you could actually read a book by it for a couple of seconds. And if you notice up here, the flames are so hot that the engines are actually translucent. You can see the light coming through the engines. This is just a composite I did of the moon and stars with Apollo 17 and the empty launch pad. I also had a chance to go back for Skylab. This is a commercial picture of Skylab and Skylab 1, which was a modified Saturn 1B that they shot off of a platform. And this is a modified Saturn V. I had a chance again to go back for a rollout of this. It's on the transporter, being brought out from the VAB. This is the VAB over here. Clearing the building. The transporter itself, I have a better picture later on of the shoes of it, but each shoe of that transporter weighed a ton. The roadbed that it rode on was 7 feet thick of river stone to carry the weight of that of the transporter with the rocket. And the gentleman here is Martin Caden, who authored Marooned, and that book came out shortly before Apollo 13 did get marooned in space, and it was very, very freaky how similar it was to it. But here you can see the shoes, and if you look closely, this is a man underneath the crawler. I had the opportunity to actually get on the crawler. You'll see, and here's a picture from the crawler looking back at the roadbed. And we were able to actually go up to the rocket, and I was so close to the rocket, I was standing this way and just shooting upward, and I was able to go up to Skylab and touch it. So my handprint went into space, at least I like to think so. This is the actual launch now of Skylab.
I also had a pass to see this launch. I did not know her at this point in time, and I didn't bring the picture, but in my pictures, I took a wide-angle shot of the launch, and in my wide-angle shot, there's a picture of her tripod and her camera.
I was at that launch.
Yes.
I rode NASA and I was on the causeway, and it was not good because the exhaust came out, covered the rocket because you're due south of it.
Yeah.
It came out of the cloud of exhaust,
Yeah.
and it was overcast that day, and I saw it for about 15 seconds.
Yeah, that's why it's looking so gray there. It is very overcast. And then, of course, we go out into Discovery. We also had Soyuz in between that, the Apollo Soyuz hookup. But Discovery, this was STS-1.
That was
No,
one
it's not.
because
It
had
can't
a
be one because
orange tank,
yeah, no,
white
this,
on one.
yeah, this is later than one. because one was, they painted
Tank wide.
the tank white, and that was the only launch that they ever painted it.
Now, we'll start to tie all this together. Many of you, or all of you, know Jay Apt. Jay was in Pittsburgh in high school, and Vern, I know you were at the Pittsburgh Spring Conventions in the 1960s. I'm thinking 1967. Jay was running that convention as a high school student. Trip Barber was there as a high school student, and I was there as an MIT student. And so let's go in that direction. My background is that at MIT, Gordon Capareso and I and Gordon Mandel, who was very active with ESTIs, formed the MIT Model Rocket Society. That was 1967, and I believe that organization is still running today. Now, one of the problems we had was it was illegal in Massachusetts to fly model rockets in 1967. And so I figured out who was a senator or a representative in the Massachusetts legislature who had a kid that flew model rockets illegally. And we approached that person and convinced them to introduce legislation modeled after the NFPA rules that Vern had carefully worked with G. Harry Stein to get his prototype legislation. I then graduated, and Tripp took up the task of getting those laws passed in Massachusetts, and it became legal around 1970 to fly model rockets. I graduated, and my first job took me to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and we have a couple of people in the room who were cross paths with us at that point in time.
That's one.
And there was a club, the Association of Bethlehem Modelers. The initials were ABM. And I left Pennsylvania in 1973 and moved to Pittsburgh and reconnected with Jay Apt and with the Steel City section and became the head of the Steel City section of the NAR. My job took me around the world for several years and then transferred me to Florida. And so I'm in Florida, there's no rocket club. Well, let's start one. So we started a rocket club. Those are fairly young participants. They were my neighbors. And the second from the right, Ricky Perez, knew this interesting girl that seemed to have an interest in rockets and seemed to go all the launches. And that fifth grader introduced me to Joy. So once we had the club started, we needed to finance the club. And the ESTI's marketing department stepped up. We offered to run demos. There were some toy distributors in Florida, and we offered to run demos at the toy distributors. The toy distributors liked the idea, and so we received shipments of kits from ESTI's, which we handed out to the participants in the club. They would build them up into rockets. We would fly them at the demos.
What year was that?
That was 1974.
Okay, that's when I met you. So you
Yes.
must have just started when I...
Yeah.
Well, that was before me, because we got met,
Yes, you
yeah, we met at the end
we
of
met at the end of
74,
74.
and I married in 75.
We launched out of an industrial park that wasn't doing very well. There was plenty of space. That's Joy at the launch control box, and putting some rockets onto the pad, also provided by ESTI's Industries. So we had a lot of help getting this started. That's me.
And in the background, this is the 33rd Street Industrial Park. That entranceway is still there. Nothing else looks the same.
Yeah, it's all built up.
Completely built.
Yes.
All
All right, well,
Yeah.
we got married, we had a daughter, some of you knew as the range rat at Narrum 17, Karen. She's
Narrow 24. She wasn't born in 17.
She wasn't born in 17, she was born in 24. That's Karen loading a rocket, and Joy claims that she learned to count down backwards before she learned to count up forwards.
With sound effects.
Yes. Now, before we go to the film clip, do you want to integrate in some of your pictures? Does that?
Oh, you can go
does that
back
do?
to them, because they're in that
Yeah.
time frame before.
Yes, that's right. Let's see if we can get that
Now most of these were Mike's pictures. I'm gonna go with that one. That was, now that's at Tarpon Springs. I grew up in Tarpon Springs, and that was when I first met them. This might have been before the launch that I first met them. But that's at Tarpon Springs Mall in the empty field, which is no longer an empty field anymore. And I guess that was one of their first contests where Orange, you, and did BCMRA come up to this one?
This was our second contest. I think this was BARC 1, Bay Area Rocket Contest.
Wow.
Yes.
We had held
Okay, the BARCs.
CFAM 1 in March of 1973,
Yeah.
or was it 74?
Now don't even remember that picture. I was obviously happy with something. That was my teammate at the time. We had a team, so this was probably more around the late 70s.
And who was your teammate?
Pat.
Oh, that
Who
was
was
Pat.
running the
That
whole
was Pat,
thing.
yeah.
The guy with the bowler hat on is
With the
Pat.
bowler hat, all right.
Yeah.
Now there's Richard, me, and Pat, so that would have been more like
It's
78, 79-ish,
Okay.
80s time frame.
Golly Pete.
Pat's Clockwork Orange period.
There's a wrecked egg lofter from somewhere. There's me and Richard at launch control for one of our contests. We started a whole series. We had like a whole full contest here in Florida, and there'd be one in Orlando, there'd be one in Newport Richie, there'd be one or two down in West Palm.
So-
Richard was running them, and then I started building rockets, and it was constantly Bob and I competing for the same trophies.
So do we have anybody from West Palm or Broward in the room at the moment?
Moose was here earlier, but he left.
Moose was part of that group, and
Yeah,
Boyette was
yeah.
part of that group.
Well, no,
No,
Boyette
Boyette
was
was
from St.
St. Pete, yeah.
Oh,
He
okay.
took it over. That's one of our
Caplinger.
meets.
This is Caplinger. This is the BCMRA field at the Davie campus of Broward
Okay.
Community College, and that's Larry Caplinger at his
Ah.
launch control. I remember right, that was all TTL logic, and it was this
Yes.
automatic launch sequencer. It was just a.
It was
And
advanced
for
for the
tracking,
time.
we
Oh, so this was mid-80s, right?
Yes.
No, I was mentioning Jay Yap. This was Yap Loft, and we all met at Moose's house. And there's a lot of people here you would see in that picture. Vernon Gleaner in there.
I was almost in that picture.
Yeah,
I decided not
Burns
to
in the
come at the
middle.
last moment.
And Moose and Jack was at Moose and Jackie's house, and they're both here.
and
And
there's
The
Richard
fellow from MIT in the middle,
Bob.
next
John
to
Kane's
John.
here.
John is here.
Matt Steele's here.
Yeah.
John was there, weren't you?
Yeah.
You weren't at that, no?
Yeah, Chris Tavares was there. He's there somewhere.
I think, is Banke there? Marc Banke? I think.
Yeah, he's
Possible. However, you won't see Jay Apt in this picture because
He was
He
in
was
isolation.
he was
he
in
was in
orbit.
isolation, yes. He wasn't
Oh,
allowed to make
isolation.
people
I went
with
to launch
crowds.
number 2.
Mike should talk about that one a little bit. He knows a little
Yeah,
bit
this
more.
was a thrust augmented Saturn V launched from a Skell-LUT. This was inspired by something that one of the Broward County modelers, Greg Browning, did a few years before, actually several years before. He used a Saturn V kit with a standard 18mm motor in each F1 engine bell, and then he had 2 F mounts, one in each strap-on. And unfortunately, he did not have F100s or any other set of engines that would match, motors that would match, except for F7s. And so he elected to fly his with F7s and the strap-ons and 5 Cs, I suppose, in the core. And was thrust augmented. Saturn needed some thrust augmenting because it plowed in, and it was a exquisite work what he'd done. It was sort of fantasy scale done, executed very well. So several years later, this is at LDRS 3 in 1984, I think, in Medina, Ohio. And so I decided to try and accomplish more or less the same thing, but with F100s, and it worked.
Okay. Okay. now
So
if you
that,
would-
I'm sorry. What?
Right,
So that was when I was going USF for 1 year. I was back in, well, maybe that was when I just after I got. Anyway, that's from Tarpon Springs, off of a beach that's been dredged out into the sand in the Gulf. And we took Mike, is that your rocket?
Yeah, it's
Three F-100?
three F-100s and a Maxi Alpha 3.
We didn't know where to safely launch something that big. So this was remote. There was nobody out there. He grabs a launch rod and he stuffs it into one of those sawed-off telephone poles, and then we just launch it on the beach that evening.
Did you recover it?
One of the F's KO'd, and so there were pieces falling into the water, and Bob remarked, that looks just like the recovery. Kids were going after the pieces, and Bob remarked it looked like the recovery divers going after pieces of an Atlas that had exploded in the Cape recently.
That's Brooksville with your Mach 1.
Yeah.
We would go up to Brooksville because they had a nice big field. And that was it. Now this is the early days before
Yeah, so
Mike
this was-
and Tom Wilson and the Pasco County Club.
So we developed this ecosystem in two respects. One was that we had enough clubs all within driving distance that we had a contest every 2 weeks or so during the contest season. And that resulted in several people getting rather good at the sport, including yourself. And then the other part of the ecosystem was this symbiotic relationship between Estes, the Estes distributors, and the clubs. And so we're all madly building these kits and then going out to the parking lots of malls and flying them, and that created the kids would then pay dues in order to get part of this opportunity. They kept the kids after they built them, and so that provided the finances for building up the strength of the organizations.
So this is just a few pictures as we go through them of Mike's initial organization with the Wilsons.
Yes.
So that was school-based
It
organization?
was initially a school club with the junior high school. The school.
But they were in Pasco County near Newport Richey, which is a little bit north on the coast of Tampa.
The school had suffered some
Bob was here
vandalism.
too, but we haven't seen him today. Oh, then that's probably in the mid-70s, and the one on the left is a kid who lived down the street from me, and he got interested, and he became a serious shipper shell
Yes.
for a couple of
That's
years.
This was the first year that helicopter duration was an event because we're all using modified gyrock designs.
And that's
This is Greg Browning's Nike Tomahawk at an early BCMRA meet. It's
Yeah, I can tell it's BCM records. I think that's the
I agree.
console.
That's the Traverse pad.
Yeah, and BC is Brevard County.
Broward.
Broward County. Broward on me.
That's Mike in younger days with his 7.5. That's Tom Wilson. That was on
That was on
that
the
picture
cover of the Model
That's
Rocketeer.
classic.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
That's a classic image.
And that was a random photo, by the way. Nothing to do with what was inside the issue.
Oh.
That's fairly early. Jim Tucci, Richard, and Richard Barnard.
Richard Fox. Yeah, that's Richard
Okay.
Barnard.
That's, I remember those pictures.
Jim Tooch.
Ah.
There's the Larry Catwinger band. The Brevard. Now we're talking Brevard County folks
Yes.
here.
These are ubiquitous. Every rocket meet you'd see these things at.
I'd forgotten I'd done that.
Big Fox.
I've always liked this picture of Richard showing him hooking up his
He's focusing.
parachute duration model at our very first rocket meet. It was in March of 1973, I think, and it was a cold and rainy day. Larry Shinosky.
Larry Shinosky.
Wow.
Ricky Perez.
Yeah.
And isn't that Tom Wilson? Pat?
Mhm.
I think so.
Yeah.
That looks,
Yeah, your typical rat
That's
mounted.
Mike's Rocket Club.
This is our club when it was at the junior high school.
Wow.
And this is us doing a display in front of a store front in
Yeah, I
Newport
remember
Richey.
doing 2 or 3 Toy King demos.
Yes.
And
Yeah, Toy King was pretty big back
Yes. We did a lot of.
okay, this is my picture. That was from about 1970s. Every week, every Sunday, I worked on Saturdays, so I pack up my rockets and drive 10 miles south to Dunedin, and I actually built that launch. I even had a guy at a metal shop because I didn't know where to get a box. I bought the Estes rotary switches and push button, and had a guy build me a launch control box at a metal cutting shop, and I built
there.
that
Multi-pad launcher.
pad out of wood.
Yeah.
So I'd meet with all these kids down there every Sunday, and we'd launch rockets. What was funny was that particular day, you can see the storms brewing. It like just came through, thunderstorm, big time. We went back to the little hobby shop that was just down the street. Storm blew over, we came back out, and it was dead calm. I watched a Cherokee D that went up to, Cherokee Ds went pretty high. It almost took the launch rod on the way back down.
Gee.
Oh, these are just my two. I did attend Apollo 15 launch. I wrote a letter to President Nixon. And anyway, I got a car pass, and I brought over some rocket buddies, and we were parked on State Road 3 just north of the VAB, and that's Apollo 15 in April of '72 with, and that was Apollo 11 on the pad. I got my first bus tour to KFC with finally got my dad to bring me across the state. Right before, a month before Apollo 11, they used to let you park out close to it. I got that picture. Oh, yeah, we're done with that.
All right, so I had the sequence of clubs, and at MIT we did the MIT convention, and in Pittsburgh we did the Pittsburgh convention, and so it followed suit that we should do something in Florida, and I offered to host NARCON 17.
The problem was, we got married in May of 1975, and July, he has me involved in running NARCON 17.
It happens.
2 months later.
And in late July, it rained.
Oh, well, we were on our honeymoon.
Is there sound on this, Rich?
Not on this sequence, the
Okay.
next sequence. That's Bruce Blackistone.
Yeah, I remember.
That was a Steve guy.
Steve,
yeah.
not Bruce, that was Steve Connors.
Connors, yes.
Similar attitudes.
But the NARCON 17 field was nicknamed the Swamp for good reason.
I ruined a pair of shoes standing on a little island, walking across that field every day for a week.
Yeah.
You walk through ankle-deep water in many parts of it.
Yeah, so this
Does
was,
this have the famous 2001 prank?
well, I cut it down, that's Paul Porzio with the camera facing us.
Oh, yeah, guy from New York.
Howard Kuhn.
Howard Kuhn. Yeah.
And Dave, he was at NARCON 50.
Dave.
He was a Virginia guy with Terry.
Yeah, we have, the original runs about half an hour on this, but we have one picture, and I don't remember, you can remind me who it is, of when we were flying plastic models, and he was coming back holding his plastic model in a handkerchief and covered from waist down in mud.
Now, the field we're at is in Orlando at the corner of.
Yeah, where SeaWorld is
Yeah,
now.
no, not SeaWorld.
Universal.
Universal, rather, yeah.
Kirkman Road.
Mm-hmm.
And it's now part of Universal Theme Park. So to get permission to use this land, I used the same technique. I found somebody who owned the property whose kid was flying model rockets, and convinced him to convince the owners of the property to let us use it. The lot was big enough, and we hired a big mowing vehicle to clear the grass off, but what we weren't counting on was a couple of weeks of rain.
He couldn't get through the grass.
Yeah, he couldn't cut it well, and it was just a swamp. We were also light on shelter, and the launch equipment we were using was very similar. Was very similar to what you would use in an area meet or a regional meet. So that took us to 7 years later. Well, there's a sequence I want to bring up. This is the sound piece.
The SST. Crank the volume in the middle.
Where?
Volume
I
knob in the
can't
middle.
see anything.
Volume knob in the middle, just one knob.
You got it? All right.
I got it up there.
Okay, you have that cranked up. Are we on the right dog?
There it's gone.
There it is. Good shape.
laptop's getting overwhelmed by data reading. This field was in Kissimmee, Florida. The red and white building was the SST museum. It was the mock-up of an SST that went to production.
Okay, we do still have a problem.
And so I'll explain. For this one, we built a permanent launch structure. There was a shelter for the launch officers. The wires were buried underground. The pads were permanent cast with cement. And so we had.
Problem on
It's not a bit
somebody go
sloppy,
out
but
there,
not nearly as bad as
we couldn't,
That's Howard Kuhn.
we couldn't find an aid. So we had to load this thing down with
State Troopers.
That was the truck. So we shared the field with a model airplane club, and they offered to fly this as part of the opening ceremony. Well, with the hat on, it's a little hard to say. Okay, we've got one more.
Anyway, after that 82 NARCON, I think a lot of people were going away to college, or Florida Rocketry, all that nasty organization between 74 and 82 just kind of dissipated. And there's clubs around now that are mostly oriented towards the big stuff, and nothing like we had back in that time frame.
Yeah, there's a little bit more on the pictures.
We had fun while it lasted.
We had a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah, hold up the Brevard County guys also had access at Motorola, I believe, to fancy publishing, and they put out this great newsletter for a couple of years.
On the offset.
Then they printed it kind of quasi-professionally at their, was it Motorola's printing?
I think so. Off hours, yeah. He could use
Yeah.
the presses.
So there's one more chapter to this, and that's the KSC connection. For the bicentennial in '76, through some personal connections, one of the public relations people at KSC reached out to the Orange Rocketeers, said, can you fly some flights out of the visitor center for the bicentennial ceremonies? And so that started about 3 or 4 years where we flew on site at KSC. This was AECM-3 in 1979, and we're flying in the grass area behind the General Administrative Building.
Or
And I've got a video of that flight right here.
Joy at the PA, and the guy in the green hat, whose name I've forgotten, was a range safety officer for KSC, and he had that duty at this event. The person on the right is Chuck Hollingshead, who was the voice of Capcom for the Apollo launches.
Was this, we also had one off the crawlerway.
Yes.
Yeah,
Same
this
time.
is the one.
This is the one.
Yeah, because we were up on a platform.
Yeah, I remember the platform being by the BAB.
So it was exciting to have the countdowns done by the real person. Then NARCON 23 was in Allentown.
Correct.
And it was run by the successors to the ABM group that I had mentioned before.
Not really. No, actually 20, well, it's a combination of basically Charlie Sykes was the contest director,
Oh, okay.
and Art Rose helped out, but, yeah.
Yes.
Rose.
Yeah, but the contest director was Charlie Simon.
Contest director was Charlie Simon.
Yeah.
Before we go on to that, the Kennedy Space Center connection too. This rocket was built from a kit, either the Estes or the Centauri. I don't know exactly. It goes back to 1974, 75 that this was, no, it had to be
That would be the
75
Centauri.
that it was built. I took this one out with me to Kennedy Space Center during the bicentennial, and they put a Kennedy stamp on it and actually stamp dated this, that we were out there, so the rocket was there. A lot of history with this rocket. It then went on to Capcom. There's an article in here I'd forgotten I had written about the TampaCon in 1976. This convention was a Star Trek convention, and we were coming from a model rocket contest and went over to the Star Trek convention, and I was carrying the rocket with me, and Wilson Tucker, who's also an author, asked if he could use the rocket in his talk, because he got to go out to Kennedy Space Center and actually press the launch button on a weather balloon. And he was very excited about that. And later, George Takei was at that convention, and he asked if he could hold the rocket, and I said, can I take a picture of you holding it? And that's on, that's one of the pictures that'll come up.
Okay, so, I think we were at NARM 23 both for the contest and also to be up to speed on what was going on in NARMs, because we were being in contention to run NARM 24. That's Karen picking up the trophy, and Vern, you're in the back there in that picture. In fact,
Yeah.
Lita is too. Yes. And Pat and Bob and Ray.
Great pile, yeah, we drove up.
Who's on the left?
Jeff,
Right, yeah, that is Jeff.
he was at Allentown College, which was kind of really nice, like, we lived in the dorms, and they had the cafeteria serving us, and we just walk out from the dorms to the field.
And
We didn't have to
that
get
was
in cars and
Pat's
drive all
background,
over
too.
the place or anything, and the field was reasonably decent.
Yes,
Yeah, and there's Pat back there.
Pat's back there.
Yeah.
So we knew we were going to be running NARM 24. The 33rd Street Park wasn't going to work out, so we convinced the owner of the field in Kissimmee where the aircrafters were flying to let us use that. And so in preparation for NARM 24, we built the launch control structure and the pads cemented into the ground. And then after NARM 24, large rockets.
Yeah, well, there was a time frame for 2 or 3 years where we started getting in what at the time was large rockets. They don't even measure up anymore. But I don't know where that was.
Yeah, anybody remember?
That wasn't that one down,
We went
Well,
down one
Williamsburg
time to the
is
West
now-
Palm, north of West Palm,
Okay.
Port St. Lucie
and
area?
launched one day down there. Anyway, that might have been that.
That's the same.
because I had a helicopter, I think, that went into the water and somebody went in and fetched it out. Boyette maybe.
And this was from what, 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
5.
6 years ago.
6 years ago. Okay.
6 years ago, yeah.
Very good.
They're on 56 this year?
Yep,
Yeah.
it is.
6 years ago.
Yep.
Ay.
And there's Joy's rocket with George Takei from the.
He looks a lot different these days too.
Yes, he does.
Yeah, he's aged a little bit.
Okay, so that's the prepared material.
Anybody got any?
You have about 2 minutes.
We have
Perfect.
2 minutes? 3
That's
minutes.
all.
Okay.
We
Just
also
one
had-
exciting thing
We
from
also had
the
a
time, I don't
we also
know.
had a world championship here. in 1992.
92, that was in Brevard County.
In Melbourne.
Close to the Cape, yeah, Melbourne.
In Melbourne.
Yeah.
Vieira.
So there's only
Forgotten
been,
about that.
2 world championships in the United States.
Oh, yeah, right, we did,
Yeah,
out of
I'd
Vieira.
forgotten about that.
Vieira, we had it at Vieira. They flew at Vieira, which is now a city, and you couldn't do it again.
Okay.
Symbols.
Well, the hobbying was in Melbourne, that's all I remember, as far as locations are concerned. And that was quite interesting. They have a number of countries that came here. It was one of the requirements about holding world championships is you need to have an airport of entry which has international flights, and Orlando met that criteria.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And you came out and flew high power at the very end.
There was a
There was a high power
small
launch at the
demo.
very end,
Yeah.
like the very last day, and the Europeans had never seen high power before.
Yeah. I didn't fly any. I supported it, but I didn't have anything to fly.
So, well,
I can't remember who did it, but I was there. Is the volume down?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
oh, yeah.
Just in case when you unplug or something.
Oh.
Well, the reason I'm here is because I was born in Sarasota
Yes.
and I grew up on Key Biscayne. And so I first flew rockets in Florida. So I wanted to see these pictures. We flew at the old Tamiami Trail Airport
Been there.
on the
Been
edge of
there.
the Everglades. And my dad got us started in this. We were all in Cub Scouts and all schoolmates and all that kind of stuff. And I'm still digging through my dad's 12,000 slides that he took, trying to find pictures of us actually flying rockets out there. But my dad assured me that I was an NAR member back then.
Wow.
But I have no clue, what that number was, and without knowing that, I can't claim it. But I remember Orange Blossom Hobbies
I was just
was
gonna
our
say,
go-to place for rockets and rocket engines and all the rest. And I remember that whole time period so fondly,
I still have an
So,
old catalog of Orange Blossom.
really, ultimately, being on the NAR board and Suns and Rockets and everything else like that has all been, that's been the genesis of it all,
Okay.
so.
We had Toy King that we went to a lot, and then Colonial Photo and Hobby, and they are still there.
They're still there.
They're
Orange Blossom.
still there, they're still selling rockets.
Yeah, Orange Blossom Hobbies in Miami, I think, when I finally
Yeah, they did. Yeah,
went out
I
of
was
business
told.
about 6-7 years ago.
Yeah.
So they tried
Yep.
to hold it. So did you know a guy named John Norcross in those days? For some reason I thought he worked at Orange Blossom and he came out to play. He flew.
The name is vaguely familiar.
Okay.
Yeah.
I remember at Tamiami he flew an F-100 in a V2, converted it the maxi V2. And
Oh, that flight.
And yeah, distinctly remember. So that's my memory of Tamiami in the early days. Cool.
Great.
Any
And I
other-
had a video, I came to one thing, that July '79 contest
Oh, yes.
drove down from Georgia. And I've got a film of that Saturn V that you had up there, so
Okay.
I can't show it to you because it's on this, but.
What media is it on? A tablet?
You can actually go to YouTube and to my YouTube channel and get it. But it's about a 10-second
Yeah.
segment of a 45-minute film. But it's there, and it's basically got that same angle, that picture of Joy and I guess you behind the thing and the Saturn V flight, so.
Well, in that time frame, we made 3 or 4 trips to MGRM, starting around 74.
That's true,
until
yeah.
late
That was when I
1980s.
wasn't doing anything,
Oh,
so I didn't see
Langford
guys.
was running them. then.
Langford and yeah.
George Gasaway always came over.
Yeah, we went out to Alabama to fly one of the Gasaway contests.
You went to
Homewood?
Alabama?
Alabama, yeah, and
In Homewood?
dual leg loft was a contest back then, and I still hold a record because after I won the height record with dual leg loft, they discontinued that contest.
Ah.
So you hold the record.
I hold the record.
I had to tell you one incident. We went up and did it with Pat. We went up, it was just me and him. Did you go to
The
that
Embry-Riddle
demo
demonstration?
at Embry-Riddle?
I was there.
And we launched some regular rockets, and it was after hours, and there was, what, a dozen people watching?
Yeah.
Anyway, we launched a few rockets, and I pulled out a Maxi Alpha that was painted in fluorescent red. And I put on the pad with one of those early composite Dynamics E20s with those white ceramic pour-in nozzles.
With
and it had a
absolutely
little
no smoke.
teeny hole up the middle. It would like form a nozzle once it started firing.
Oh, yeah.
There was a washer right at the throat. But put it on with one of his igniters. That was Rosenfield's early days. And that thing went up on the igniter about 30 feet in the air. And then it hadn't ignited. Anyway, the thing kind of stopped there, went over, bent at about that angle, and the engine suddenly kicked in full bore. And there was a Mustang parked about 200 feet down in the parking lot. It hit its passenger window full bore. And we're all going, oh my God. It didn't damage the window.
Wow.
There was just a spattering of fluorescent chip paint all over the side of the car.
We had one with a Pershing missile.
Never
nose
figured out what
cone.
happened to that engine.
Went into, it was a station wagon.
Pershing nose cone?
Yeah,
Stuck in-
it
We
hit
had a
the
real
windshield
warhead impact
and
and break a window.
It did, one of those spider splatters, yeah.
I still have a very great fondness for fluorescent paint from back in that era. And I actually do have some of my rockets from back then, and they're out in my garage. Various family members have saved them. There's a tackle box that was converted to a range box. It has some D13s in it and some thermalite and things like that in it. But we always had this beautiful lettering on the sides of our rockets because my mom actually was the owner and publisher of the Islander newspaper on Key Biscayne. And so she had all this beautiful lettering in different styles and fonts and everything else to use for the headlines of the magazine. And she would let us use, like 6 letters, or something like that. But the rocket names were Daddy-O, Big Daddy-O, Mommy-O. Classic stuff from the 1960s.
I don't have anything else. Floor's open if anybody wants to comment.
Really enjoyed
Thank you.
watching
Yes.
Thank
yes.
you.
seeing
Thank
some
you.
of that history again.
We don't even see, well, I see Mike frequently, and I see the news rather frequently, but we see them rarely, so it's always fun to get back together with something like this.
It's like time never
Yes, you pick right up.
progressed. You pick right up, you pick right up.
That's exactly right. That's how it's
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful fact.
These are, Rich,